If you lived through the 60s, then you should be quite familiar with a lot of bands from the time. The Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Beach Boys, the Doors, you name them. Their hits had everyone up on their feet then, and frankly, they still get heads bumping to this day.
Three brothers, the most successful singer-songwriters of our time.
Little wonder then that in the seas of these history-defying acts are a couple of worthy outfits that were underappreciated and just vanished without a trace. Poof! The big question now, where are these bands? And why couldn't they stand the test of time? So without further ado, from folk to Motown to the British invasion, here are 12 of the biggest bands from the 60s we've all forgotten about. And maybe you can decide which ones we need back. Number 12. Clear Light. What's one major reason why bands often fade off into history? Ding ding ding, they always make the rather unfortunate choice to disband the group. So it's only fair we start with a band that sadly suffered this fate. And with that, our list is off to a start. Clear Light. Do you remember these guys? Well, you probably didn't. Why though? Because they only ever released one self-titled album back in 1967. One self-titled album that made quite the wave. These West Coast psychedelic rockers made some pretty good music, with a number of distinctive characteristics singling out their sound. Not least their imaginatively blended elements of classical and folk music, plus inclusion of two drummers. Clear Light's sole album was notably produced by Paul Rothchild, who is, of course, most remembered for his work with the Doors, and was engineered by Bruce Botnick, another legend who worked behind the desk to help shape some of the most impressive acts from the 60s. So yeah, Clear Light was that big. As for the group itself, they were undeniably talented, but just couldn't agree on a lot of things. The band eventually disbanded in 1968 due to personal changes and disagreements with management. Sadly, their work on a sophomore album was also abandoned. The world never got to see enough of Clear Light, but they still left behind that one great album.
You're pushing too hard on what you want me to be.
Number 11. The Seeds. A wise man once said, "If something isn't broken, don't try fixing it." And this next forgotten band embodies these wise words. In 11th place, The Seeds. Just like Clear Light, these guys were another standout psychedelic rock group from LA. The Seeds got together in 1965 and continued making music together until 1968, when they changed their name and personnel, an unnecessary shift that marked an abrupt end to their most fruitful years. The Seeds' founding member and lead singer, Sky Saxon, would even go on to release music under a bunch of different monikers, but would still never replicate the success he had with the group. In the Seeds' original lineup, Saxon was joined by San Savage, Jeremy Leving, Daryl Hopper, and Rick Andridge. Together, they released 3 albums under the name The Seeds before their unfortunate dissolution in 1967. A lot was in play that led to the band's dissolution. Internal creative differences, changing musical trends, potential declining popularity with the music scene, and of course, certain personnel changes. So, what came of the Seeds in the end? Well, nothing. The group did come back together a couple times, but it always ended the same way, with them breaking up. In 2003, original members Savage and Saxon reformed the group, but that mid-60s magic was gone. Yet again, another great band the world never got to enjoy enough, marred by their own personal decisions. Number 10. Nirvana. do you know that the 90s grunge kings, Nirvana, weren't even the first band to bear that name? Yeah, you probably didn't know that. So how about a little history lesson? Next up, 60s Nirvana. These guys, unlike the Nirvana you know, came together in London back in 1965. In fact, they later sued Kurt Cobain and the company over the name. It was eventually settled in court, but the band did more than just sue your favorite band. Like so many of the best outfits of that decade, Nirvana pushed the envelope in terms of their production and their material, with artistic and classical compositions that usually incorporated unusual effects. Nirvana actually didn't follow the trend of the last two bands that's been on our list. They lived on to the 70s and even resurfaced again in the 90s. But even with all that, it's their two albums from the 60s, The Story of Simon Simopath and All of Us, for which the group is most fondly remembered. Of particular note is the legendary list of engineers and producers who worked with Nirvana and who would eventually become noted for their talents to bigger acts. No surprise then that the group's music sounds so immaculate and inventive. You'll hear hints of the Beach Boys and the Beatles here, but Nirvana still possessed an original sound of their own. A band more than worthy of being remembered and brought back. In fact, Nirvana is still active today, sporadically producing new materials. But so many of the bands on our list haven't been this lucky. Number 9. The Turtles. So far, none of the bands have really enjoyed commercial success. Well, how about we change that? That brings us to the 9th band on our list, the Turtles. Here's another LA rock band that just never reached their full potential, even after producing a massive hit. Remember Happy Together? Yeah, you're looking at the geniuses behind that massive hit. The band still achieved several top 40 hits throughout the later half of the 60s. Their infectious pop sound defined the era and many other bands that were created afterward. However, at the end of the decade came the unfortunate end of their success. The group became plagued with several management issues, serious lawsuits, and conflicts with White Whale Records, their label. The Turtles would eventually call it quits with more golden hits, a second compilation album, and Wooden Head, a B-sides in the 1970s. With the end of the Turtles, White Whale Records lost its number one moneymaker and soon ceased operations. Howard Kalin and Mark Volman, two original members of the band, were joined by Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, which, for contractual reasons, performed under different names, such as Flo and Eddie. In the end, the name The Turtles was just reduced to a nostalgic flash of a different time, all because of a petty, stubborn record label. Number 8. The Tremolets. Next up is a band that once went toe-to-toe with the Beatles in an edition and actually came out on top. Sounds impossible, right? Well, it isn't. This band in question is the Tremolets. Quite like the Turtles, they were all the rave in the 60s, famous for songs like Here Comes My Baby and Do You Love Me? The band actually enjoyed their fair share of fame. In fact, in 1962, the Beatles and the Tremolets auditioned for Decca Records. The Beatles performed up to 15 songs, including Hello Little Girl, Three Cool Cats, The Sheik of Araby, and a couple of others. However, the label turned them down, saying that groups of guitars were on their way out. A decision the label would probably have regretted later on. Decca instead went for Brian Poole and the Tremolets because apparently they'd be easier to work with. In the next year, the band scored their first number one single, Do You Love Me? So they were doing fine until they weren't. However, their bright bubblegum just couldn't keep on pace with the darker, edgier tone of the late 60s sound. So, they also tried proving that they could create more serious music. This, as you'd expect, didn't turn out how they wanted. Their music didn't get the reception they were expecting, and they just ended up alienating their fans. The Tremellis are still performing today, though there have been a couple of new members. A rather sad end to a band with much potential. And they aren't the only group who have struggled with an evolution in the music scene. Number 7. The Grassroots. The difference in sounds between the 60s and 70s was a major detriment to the popularity decline of a handful of bands from the decade. In 7th place is a band that probably suffered from this the most, the Grassroots. Turning out chart toppers like Let's Live for Today and Midnight Confessions, Grassroots were primed to take over. But it's really never that easy. The group suffered a major decline in popularity in the late 60s, primarily stemming from a couple of interrelated factors. For starters, a lack of creative control due to their label, Dunhill Records, dictating their sound. What really was with the record labels in the 60s? However, besides that, major lineup changes played its role. Joel Larson, the band's drummer, left before they could even release their first album. And lastly, the changing musical landscape of the 60s meant that they couldn't consistently produce hits any longer. Even the Grassroots' most notable hits weren't written by them. While this takes absolutely nothing from their success in the 60s, it all contributed, though, to why they couldn't survive in the new musical landscape. The Grassroots continued to perform live well into the 2000s, and until the death of the original member of the group, Rob Grill. Number 6. The Sonics. The 70s were the year of punk rock. Prevalent rock and roll sounds of the 60s was gone, and the world was embracing something new. But have you ever wondered what group pioneered this new sound? In 6th place, the Sonics. Punk way before the term punk went mainstream, Washington natives, the Sonics, were light years ahead of the game in pretty much every aspect. But even being a pioneer doesn't guarantee immortality. Using simple chord progressions and basic technology, this garage rock band borrowed from rockabilly, R&B, and soul to create a dirty, shattering, and above all, hard-hitting sound that would go on to shape music forever. Hits like The Witch and Psycho influenced punk rockers well into the 70s. To the modern ears of today, the Sonics' music still sounds extraordinary. However, they wouldn't be on here if it had been a happy ending. After the group signed to Jirden Records in 1966 and recorded their album introducing the Sonics to the world, their sound changed drastically. It was all cleaner, slicker, and most importantly, not them, which many people blame on the label executives. In the end, the band absolutely hated the album and called it garbage. Just a year later, they all broke up, with some members going to college or joining other bands. And with that, the end of a band that was meant to live forever. They reunited, however, in 2007 and began playing again. They even headlined at the Cave Stomp Festival in New York, one of the most underappreciated bands of their time. Number 5. The Zombies. Have you ever heard of a band breaking up right before taking off? Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, that was the case of the Zombies in 5th place. Rod Argent, Paul Atkinson, and Hugh Grundy came together in 1961 to form the Zombies. Unfortunately, they didn't achieve fame until 1964, after they signed a record contract with Decca and released their first hit song, She's Not There, which eventually became their first UK Top 40 hit. It was uphill from there. the group continued making hit song after hit song in the UK. All that was left was to bridge to the US markets, which they eventually did in 1968 with Time of the Season, a timeless and seasonal classic. Despite this, getting just what they actually needed, the Zombies still didn't become the global phenomenon it was supposed to be. Why? The band decided to dissolve right before the release of their most critically acclaimed album, Odyssey and Oracle. This meant that they couldn't do shows together to perform their biggest hit, Time of the Season, from that same album. The Zombies basically broke up because management issues. Their first single from the album was a flop, and the band believed that there was no way back from there. Guess they were so wrong. The group briefly reunited in the 80s and again in 2004. Regardless of how it ended, the Zombies are still regarded as one of the greatest bands ever, but still one that has faded off into history. Number 4. The Association. There has been a trend of bands still missing out on broader fame, even after achieving commercial success. Truth is, it takes more than popular music to live forever. Next up is a group that actually embodies this trend the most. In 4th place, The Association. Whatever reason it is, the California band unfortunately takes center stage in this category, and it's not for a lack of depth in material. In the late 1960s, this underrated group served up a series of extremely popular hits to the masses. If you are around that time, it was near impossible to miss the Association's hits Along Comes Mary, Cherish, Windy, and Never My Love on the radio. The group's smooth harmonies conquered the world. However, just like several other bands on here, they couldn't keep up with the edgier music the world was into. Besides that, a core member of the group, Jules Alexander, left for India. They also switched labels in 1972. The death of bassist Brian Cole a year after the label switched led to a flurry of personnel changes that the world couldn't get behind. In the end, irrespective of all the comeback attempts, the world had moved on. Their music was just too tied to the 60s. However, now, looking back, maybe we disregarded one of the finest bands in history. Talking about bands the world needs back, The Association fits the bill perfectly. Number 3. The Young Rascals. We've seen bands that did everything wrong that led to their inevitable downfall. Well, what about a talented group that did everything right? Stayed together, made good music, adapted to evolving sounds, and still fell off eventually? Taking us into our top 3 spots, the Young Rascals. How New Jersey's The Young Rascals remain so unheard is probably the biggest mystery of our list. These guys have actually been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Songwriters Hall of Fame, and the Vocal Group Hall of Fame. Yet, how many of their hits can you call right now? The group certainly had hits with their 1966 self-titled album, particularly enjoying critical and commercial success. Eddie Brigati provided vocals, backing vocals, and percussion. Gene Cornish, vocals and guitar. Felix Cavalier, vocals and keyboard. And Dino Danelli, drums. Together, they made some of the best blue-eyed souls from the 60s or any other decade. Not only that, but they didn't just stand still to be swept aside like the decade they dominated. The Young Rascals actually continued evolving with the times, releasing up to 9 albums stretching from the 60s to early 70s, and were not afraid to experiment. The Rascals were easy on the ear with exemplary songwriting and charming harmonies, but they didn't go all out to easy commercialism. Maybe there is no blueprint for immortality.
No room for those little things.
Number 2. Silver Apples. Can only two people actually make up a band? Well, the next group on our list answered this question. In second place is a group. No, scratch that. A duo. One that became true innovative pioneers of the 60s era. Next up, New York's Silver Apples. This is one outfit that is name-checked by a lot, but actually remembered by a few. The reason Silver Apples are cited by a number of innovative acts as key influences is pretty much down to their incredible approach and attitude. Plus, it doesn't hurt that their songs remain one breathtaking listen, even several decades on. Two men, Simeon and Danny Taylor, make up this group, and they were the first pop rock acts to actually embrace electronic music and present it to the world. This, coupled with their swirling, hypnotic lyric poems, made their songs all the more enjoyable and near unforgettable. Near. Their downfall was quite tragic, one of the worst on the list. After a lawsuit filed by Pan Am Airlines over the artwork on their sophomore album Contract, which had the band posing in a plane cockpit with drugs in hand, the album had to be pulled off the shelves and inevitably off the minds of the people. The lawsuit also led to the collapse of their label, a totally avoidable end. That seems like the theme of today's videos. Number 1. The Creation. And finally, 11 great bands later, we've reached quite possibly the most unfortunate band of the 60s. Not every talented UK band from the 60s could achieve even half of what the Beatles were able to. But what of a band that was arguably just as good as the Beatles and the Who combined? Claiming our number 1 spot, English rock band The Creation. These guys were praised for having it all: the stylish ambition and sophistication of the Beatles, the sheer power of the Who, and a rare invention and ability lead guitarist Eddie Phillips showed every time he had a mic to his face. You're obviously wondering, why then didn't they live forever in our memories? Well, a combination of factors meant the band would never dominate the world. Instability in the group's lineup, for one. That, combined with inexplicably poor sales in the UK, even after they scored big in Germany, meant that they couldn't live much longer in our memories. Regardless of all of these, anyone who listened to The Creation, even for 1 minute, would agree that, based on just their obvious talent and overwhelming sense of wasted opportunity, they deserve to top this list. However, even with their sad end, the Creation alumni eventually enjoyed music careers of varying success, most notably Ronnie Wood, who made it to the Faces, the Jeff Beck Group, and the Rolling Stones. Thankfully, a proper selection of reissues, compilations, and live albums mean we all, the modern audience, can enjoy the Creation's breathtaking creations. Get it? Well, with that, our stroll through the record stores of the 60s comes to an end. The truth is, many of these bands were one good decision away from being written in time forever. Maybe all publicity isn't good publicity, and there's just no formula for being immortal. So, tell us, which of these outfits do you think the world misses the most?